What you are about to hear is a work of fiction. The people, places, and events depicted in this story are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual individuals, living or deceased, or to real situations is purely coincidental. These stories may explore themes of crime, injustice, and human suffering. While fictional, they reflect real emotions and difficult truths that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
You're live, Roger. Every single one of our listeners can hear you right now. So why don't you tell them what you did to Patricia Holworth? Dead air filled the studio. The only sound was heavy breathing and the soft hum of recording equipment. 80,000 listeners waited in digital silence. But to understand how Diane Mitchell exposed her predator partner to those 80,000 live listeners, we need to go back 3 months to when she still trusted the man sitting across from her in their cramped podcast studio. Before we go on, consider subscribing to the channel to be notified as new stories are published. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know just how far our stories reach. Diane Mitchell adjusted her headphones and glanced at the glowing red recording light. At 52, she had found her calling later in life, but Victims' Voices had become more than just a podcast. It was her mission. 3 years ago, fresh from a messy divorce that left her questioning everything, she'd partnered with Roger Thornton to create something meaningful. Now, they had 80,000 regular listeners who tuned in every Tuesday and Friday to hear stories of survival, justice, and hope. Ready for episode 95? Roger asked, his voice warm and reassuring as always. At 48, he had the kind of voice that made people lean in closer. Smooth, trustworthy, with just enough gravelly texture to suggest depth. He handled all the technical aspects of their production, while Diane focused on research and conducting interviews with survivors. Always, Diane replied, watching him adjust levels on the mixing board with practiced ease. Roger had built their entire setup from scratch, designed their website, managed their social media presence. Without his technical expertise, Victims' Voices would never have grown beyond her laptop and a cheap microphone. Today's episode is going to be powerful, Roger continued, pulling up their show notes on his tablet. Jennifer's story about escaping that trafficking ring, our listeners need to hear this. Diane nodded, shuffling through her carefully prepared questions. This was what she loved most about their work, giving survivors a platform to share their truth. Every Tuesday and Friday, she sat in this small studio above Roger's apartment, surrounded by acoustic foam and tangled cables, knowing that somewhere out there, people were listening who needed to hear these stories. The red light blinked, and they were live. Welcome back to Victims' Voices, Diane began, her professional voice sliding into place. I'm Diane Mitchell. And I'm Roger Thornton. Her co-host added smoothly. Today we're speaking with Jennifer, a survivor of human trafficking who escaped after 3 years and now works to help other victims find freedom. As they conducted the interview, Diane noticed something she'd been seeing more frequently in recent weeks. Roger was asking unusually specific questions, not just about Jennifer's escape, but about her support system, whether she had family, if she felt isolated or alone. When Jennifer mentioned struggling financially since her escape, Roger's questions became even more pointed. Jennifer, Roger said during a commercial break, I know this is difficult, but our listeners really connect with survivors. Have you considered doing a follow-up interview in a few weeks? Maybe we could discuss resources available to help people in your situation. After they wrapped the episode, Diane lingered as Roger packed up his equipment. You've been doing great work with the follow-ups lately, she said carefully. I noticed you've been personally responding to more listener emails. Roger looked up from coiling an XLR cable, his expression pleased. I've been thinking we should do more community building. These people trust us, Diane. They share their deepest traumas with us every week. Don't we owe them more than just a thank you email? What kind of community building? Listener spotlight episodes, maybe some video calls with people who write in. I've been corresponding with this woman. Patricia Holworth. She's 71, lost her husband last year, and our podcast has really helped her cope. She has an incredible story. Her husband was actually murdered, but the case was never solved. Diane felt a small chill, though she couldn't explain why. Murdered? 20 years ago. The investigation went cold, but Patricia has all these theories about what really happened. She thinks the police missed crucial evidence. I was thinking maybe we could do a special episode about it. You know, give her a voice to tell her side of the story. That sounds intense for someone who's still grieving. Roger's hand paused on the cable. You worry too much, Diane. Not everyone needs protecting from their own story. Patricia specifically asked if we could help bring attention to her husband's case. She wants justice. That evening, Diane sat in her small apartment, editing their latest episode while her cat, Whiskers, supervised from the back of her chair. She'd always trusted Roger's instincts about their show, but something felt different lately. Maybe it was the way he'd started taking more control over listener correspondence, or how he seemed to remember oddly specific details about their audience members' personal lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from her nephew Tyler. Dinner tomorrow? I'll cook if you bring dessert. Diane smiled, typing back her acceptance. Tyler was 24, a computer programmer who worked remotely for a cybersecurity firm. After her divorce, he'd become one of her closest confidants. Young enough to understand the digital world she was still navigating, but wise beyond his years when it came to reading people. The next evening, Tyler's apartment smelled like garlic and herbs. He'd made his famous chicken marsala, and Diane had brought tiramisu from the Italian bakery they both loved. So how's the podcast empire? Tyler asked, serving generous portions onto their plates. Growing every week, we're approaching our 100th episode, which is crazy to think about. Diane paused, twirling pasta around her fork. Roger wants to do a live special to celebrate. That's awesome. You should be proud. 80,000 listeners is no joke. Tyler, can I ask you something? As someone who understands computers and people online, her nephew set down his fork, immediately attentive. What's going on? Diane hesitated, feeling foolish. It's probably nothing, but Roger has been different lately, more involved with individual listeners. He created this private Facebook group for what he calls special listeners, people who've written in with particularly difficult stories. Did you join the group? He said it was for people who needed extra support and that my presence might make them feel self-conscious about sharing. Even as she said it, Diane realized how strange it sounded. Tyler's expression grew serious. What else has he been doing? Video calls with listeners. One-on-one therapy sessions, he calls them. And he's been accessing our listener database at odd hours. I can see the login activity on our hosting platform. Diane. Tyler set down his fork entirely. That's not normal podcast behavior. You know that, right? Maybe he's just passionate about helping people. Or maybe he's taking advantage of vulnerable people who trust you both. Tyler pulled out his laptop. What's his last name again? And do you know if he's had other podcasts before? Thornton, Roger Thornton, and yes, he mentioned a few other shows, but they didn't last long. He said it was hard to find the right co-host. Tyler's fingers flew across the keyboard. Mind if I do some digging? Just basic public record stuff, social media history. Diane nodded, though part of her hoped Tyler wouldn't find anything troubling. 2 hours later, Tyler's expression was grim. Diane, you need to see this. He'd pulled up a complex web of information across multiple browser tabs. Roger Thornton has had 5 different podcasts in the past 7 years. Each one focused on true crime or survivor stories. Each one had a female co-host who did the interviews while he handled technical aspects. Maybe he just hasn't found the right... Each podcast ended abruptly, with the co-host claiming they had creative differences or personal issues. But look at this pattern. Tyler pulled up a timeline he'd created. Every single time, about 6 months before the podcast ended, There were listener complaints posted in true crime forums about feeling pressured to share personal information or give money for special projects. Diane's stomach dropped. Money? Crime Scene Confidential ended when listeners reported the male host was soliciting donations for a documentary that never got made. Survivor stories folded after multiple elderly listeners said they'd been contacted privately and asked to invest in a victim advocacy nonprofit that didn't exist. This can't be the same person. Tyler pulled up a cached photo from one of the defunct podcast websites. It was definitely Roger, though he'd been using the last name Thorne instead of Thornton. There's more, Aunt Diane. I found some concerning activity around your current listener database. Someone's been running queries to filter for specific demographics: age, location, recent trauma, mentions of financial resources or inheritance. The tiramisu suddenly tasted like cardboard in Diane's mouth. What kind of specific demographics? Elderly listeners, recently widowed, isolated from family, previous victims of crime, people who might be particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Diane thought about Patricia Holworth, about Roger's unusual interest in her husband's unsolved murder case. Tyler, I need you to help me figure out exactly what Roger has been doing with our listeners. Over the next week, Tyler conducted a thorough investigation of Roger's digital footprint. What he discovered was horrifying in its systematic cruelty. Roger had been using the podcast as a sophisticated recruiting tool, identifying vulnerable listeners through their emails and social media activity. He'd created detailed profiles of potential victims, focusing particularly on elderly women who'd experienced trauma and had access to financial resources. Patricia Holworth wasn't just a grieving widow seeking justice. She'd given Roger $30,000 for a documentary about her husband's murder that would never be made. Roger had convinced her that solving her husband's case would help other families find closure, playing on her desire to give meaning to her loss. He's not just stealing money, Tyler explained, as they sat in Diane's living room, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens. He's collecting personal information for identity theft. Social security numbers, banking details, medical information. Some of these women have given him enough information to completely destroy their lives. Diane stared at a photo of Patricia Holworth, a kind-faced woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. How many victims? At least 6 that I can confirm, but probably more. Total financial damage is over $200,000. And Diane. Tyler hesitated. He's been recording those private video sessions. He has hours of footage of these women sharing their most painful memories, their family details, their daily routines. Why would he record them? Blackmail, maybe, or just to study their vulnerabilities more effectively. This isn't random, it's predatory behavior with a very specific system. Diane felt sick. For 3 years, she'd unknowingly been part of a sophisticated scam that targeted the most vulnerable people imaginable. I have to confront him. Be careful. If he realizes you know, he could disappear like he did with the other podcasts. And he controls all your technical infrastructure. He could delete everything, including evidence we might need. But Diane couldn't wait. The next day, she met Roger at their usual coffee shop before recording. Roger, I need to ask you about Patricia Holworth. His hand paused halfway to his mouth, coffee cup suspended in the air. What about Patricia? I know about the documentary money. Roger set down his cup carefully, his expression shifting from surprise to something colder. I think you're confused, Diane. $30,000 for a documentary that doesn't exist. How many others are there? You're being paranoid. Patricia is an elderly woman dealing with grief. Sometimes people in her situation become confused about conversations they've had. I've seen the bank records, Roger. Tyler helped me. Tyler? Roger's voice sharpened. You involved your nephew in our business? That's a serious breach of trust, Diane. Our listeners confide in us because they believe we'll protect their privacy. Their privacy? You've been recording them without consent. Roger leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd shouted. You need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove, especially when you're accusing someone who has access to every technical aspect of your precious podcast. Are you threatening me? I'm reminding you that I control the hosting accounts, the website, the social media profiles, the equipment, everything that makes victims' voices exist. Without me, you have nothing, and if you start spreading lies about me, I'll make sure everyone knows that Diane Mitchell lost her mind and destroyed her own show with paranoid delusions. Diane stared at this man she'd trusted for 3 years, seeing him clearly for the first time. The 100th episode, the live special. What about it? You're planning something for the live show, aren't you? A grand finale before you disappear with whatever money you can get. Roger smiled, and there was nothing warm about it anymore. The live show is next Friday, Diane. 80,000 listeners, our biggest audience ever. I'd hate for you to miss it because you've had some kind of breakdown. That evening, Diane called Tyler immediately after leaving the coffee shop. He threatened me. Not directly, but he made it clear that he could destroy everything if I expose him. Then we need to be smarter than him, Tyler said. The live show is in 6 days. That's our opportunity. How? He's counting on controlling the technical aspects, right? But what if he doesn't have complete control? Over the next 5 days, Tyler worked around the clock to prepare. He secretly backed up all of Victims' Voices content to a secure server Roger couldn't access. More importantly, he created a hidden broadcasting setup that would allow Diane to take control of their live stream from her phone if necessary. They contacted Patricia Holworth, who was initially reluctant to believe that Roger had scammed her. But when Tyler showed her evidence of his previous podcast scams, she became a crucial ally. I want to help, Patricia said during their video call. If this can prevent him from hurting other people, I'll do whatever you need. Tyler also prepared a comprehensive evidence package for law enforcement, but they agreed to wait until after the live show to avoid tipping off Roger. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for October. Diane sat in their familiar studio, watching Roger set up equipment with his usual efficiency. To anyone else, he would have seemed like the same supportive partner she'd known for 3 years. Big night, he said, adjusting her microphone with careful precision. 80,000 people waiting to hear what we have to say. Yes, Diane replied, her phone hidden in her lap with Tyler's app ready. It's going to be unforgettable. At exactly 7 p.m., they went live. Good evening, and welcome to a very special episode of Victims' Voices, Diane began, her professional voice steady despite her racing heart. I'm Diane Mitchell. And I'm Roger Thornton, he added smoothly. Tonight marks our 100th episode, and we want to thank every single one of our 80,000 listeners for being part of this journey. For the first 30 minutes, everything proceeded normally. They discussed upcoming episodes, shared listener feedback, and talked about the impact their show had made. Roger was charming and eloquent, the perfect podcast host. But then Diane began inserting subtle references to their topic. Speaking of impact, she said, it's important for our listeners to be aware of how predators can use our stories, our vulnerabilities against us. Roger's smile tightened slightly. That's true, Diane. Elder abuse in particular is often perpetrated by people who gain trust first. Exactly. People who seem helpful, caring, but are actually gathering information to exploit later. Right. Though we should be careful not to make our listeners paranoid about everyone who tries to help them. Diane could see Roger growing uncomfortable, but he couldn't stop the live show without looking suspicious to their audience. Roger, you've been doing a lot of one-on-one work with listeners lately. How do you ensure those interactions remain appropriate? His hand moved toward the mixing board, but stopped. I just try to be supportive. Some people need extra attention. Like Patricia Holworth? Roger went very still. I'm not sure we should be discussing individual listeners on the air. Actually, I think Patricia would like to discuss it herself. Diane tapped her phone. Patricia, are you there? Tyler had Patricia standing by on a conference call, and her voice came through crystal clear. "Hello, Diane." "And hello, Roger." Roger's face had gone pale. "Patricia, I don't think this is—" "Roger?" Patricia's voice was steady and determined. "I think it's time our listeners knew about the $30,000 I gave you for a documentary that never existed." "Patricia, you're confused." "I'm 71 years old, but I'm not confused. I have bank records, email correspondence, and recordings of our video calls where you promised to solve my husband's murder in exchange for funding your fake documentary." Roger lunged for the kill switch on their broadcasting equipment, but nothing happened. Tyler's override system was working perfectly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Diane said calmly, "what you're hearing is someone who has been systematically scamming our listeners for months. Patricia Holworth is just one of at least 6 victims who've given money to fake projects, shared personal information that was used for identity theft, and been recorded without consent during private sessions." "This is insane," Roger said, standing up from his chair. "Diane has had a breakdown. She's making up." "I'm not making up your previous podcasts under the name Roger Thorne. I'm not making up the pattern of female co-hosts who mysteriously had creative differences with you right before their shows ended. And I'm certainly not making up the evidence package that's already been delivered to law enforcement." Roger headed for the studio door, but through the small window, they could see uniformed officers waiting in the hallway. Tyler had tipped off police to stand by after the show began. The man who had seemed so caring, so trustworthy, slumped back into his chair. "You're live, Roger. Every single one of our listeners can hear you right now. So why don't you tell them what you did to Patricia Holworth?" The dead air stretched for 30 seconds that felt like hours. When Roger finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I needed the money. They trusted me, and I needed the money." "What about the recorded sessions? The identity theft?" "I don't know. I don't know anymore." What? Through their studio window, they watched police officers enter the hallway. "This is Diane Mitchell," she said to their 80,000 listeners, "and this is the last episode of Victims' Voices that will feature Roger Thornton. But it won't be the last episode of our show." 6 weeks later, Diane sat in a new studio. Smaller, simpler, but entirely under her control. Tyler had become her new technical producer, and their first guest for their relaunch was Patricia Holworth. "The hardest part," Patricia was saying, "wasn't losing the money. It was realizing that someone had studied my grief, my desire for justice, and turned it into a weapon against me. That manipulation is what makes this type of crime so devastating," Diane replied. "But Patricia, you've turned this experience into advocacy work. Tell our listeners about the Elder Protection Initiative you've started." "After Roger's arrest, I learned there are hundreds of similar scams targeting older adults every year. People use our loneliness, our trust, against us. But we're not helpless. We can protect each other by sharing information, staying connected, and trusting our instincts when something feels wrong." Tyler, monitoring from the control booth, gave them a thumbs up. Their audience was growing again. Many of their original listeners had returned, and word of mouth was bringing new people who wanted to support a podcast that had exposed predatory behavior rather than enabling it. Roger Thornton had been charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Law enforcement had recovered most of the stolen money from his various accounts, and 6 victims had come forward to testify. He was facing 20 years in federal prison. "We have an email from listener Jennifer in Colorado," Diane said, pulling up their correspondence. She writes, "Thank you for showing us that victims can fight back. Your exposure episode didn't just give Patricia a voice, it showed all of us how to use our own voices to protect each other." Patricia smiled. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not just surviving what happened to us, but making sure it doesn't happen to others." "Exactly," Diane said. And that's going to wrap up today's episode of Victims' Voices. I'm Diane Mitchell. I'm Patricia Holworth. "And I'm Tyler Mitchell from the booth," her nephew added with a grin. Thank you for listening, for supporting survivor stories, and for helping us build a community based on genuine care rather than exploitation. We'll see you next Tuesday. As they wrapped up the recording, Diane reflected on how much had changed. They'd lost some listeners who were uncomfortable with the drama, but they'd gained others who appreciated their commitment to protecting vulnerable people. More importantly, they'd transformed their show into something that actually helped people rather than putting them at risk. "Aunt Diane," Tyler said as he packed up equipment, "we got 3 more emails today from people saying our podcast helped them recognize scam attempts targeted at their elderly relatives." Diane smiled, scratching whiskers behind the ears. The cat had become their unofficial studio mascot, and their listeners loved seeing her in their video content. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Miss Mitchell, I'm a detective in Phoenix investigating a podcast-related fraud case. Could we schedule a call? Your episode about Roger Thornton may be connected to our investigation." "Looks like our work isn't done yet," Diane told Tyler, showing him the message. "Good," he replied. "The world needs more people willing to speak up." Patricia gathered her notes, preparing to head home. "Diane, I want you to know. What happened with Roger was terrible, but it led to this. To us, working together, to protecting other people, to giving real voices to real victims. Sometimes the worst experiences teach us how strong we actually are." Diane hugged her friend and co-host. "Same time next week? Wouldn't miss it. We have 3 more survivor interviews lined up, plus that series on recognizing online manipulation tactics." As they locked up the studio, Diane thought about their 80,000 listeners, now closer to 90,000, who tuned in every week, not just to hear stories, but to be part of a community that genuinely cared about protecting each other. Roger Thornton had used their trust to prey on vulnerable people, but in exposing him, they'd learned something valuable about the power of authentic connection. Real community wasn't built on exploitation, but on transparency, mutual support, and the courage to speak truth even when it was difficult. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email from their hosting platform. "Congratulations! Victims' Voices has reached 100,000 downloads this month." Diane smiled, looking forward to sharing the milestone with Patricia and Tyler next week. They'd built something real, something lasting, something that actually helped people instead of harming them. And every Tuesday and Friday, when that red recording light came on, she knew that 80,000 listeners were trusting her with their time and attention. This time, that trust would be earned, protected, and honored. The best stories Diane had learned weren't just about surviving. They were about making sure others didn't have to go through the same pain. And in that mission, she'd found not just her voice, but her purpose. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.